today is Tariff Day. Happy Tariff Day. As President Trump imposes 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico, and then an additional 10% on the many tariffs that he's imposed on China. Joining us now to discuss, the in-house economist of the Vince Coglianese Show and economist of the Heritage Foundation, E.J. Antoni. E.J., good to talk to you, sir.
Vince, you too. Kind of a slow news day in my world. I don't know about you. I don't know if you got anything going on.
It's been
today,
super
but,
slow.
It's just kind of same old, you know.
It's been super slow. Actually, it's been such a fast news day for me. So much is going on that my iPhone battery just keeps running out. I have to keep plugging it back in. So it's been very busy today, EJ.
Well, congrats. I know everyone else has already said it, but I got to add mine to the list. Well deserved, my man.
Thank
Good
you
job.
very much. And for those who haven't heard all 3 hours of our program, you may have missed it. Starting March 17th, I will be taking over for the great Dan Bongino, 12 to 3 nationwide on his radio program. I'll also be taking the helm at the podcast that he does each day at 11 o'clock in the morning. That's all ahead. So we've got some busy weeks as we prepare and finally launch a very big show coming up. So thank you for that, EJ. And the nice thing, as I was saying earlier, is that you are billed by, but people may not realize this, but you're billed as the in-house economist by a lot of radio hosts now across the country. They've all taken this idea from me. They think that it's great that they have their own. But Dan also has you as his economist, so now I can at least consolidate that role for you and clean up your Twitter profile a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. We need some extra character room. So that's actually the whole reason behind this move.
Yeah,
it was to give me a little bit more wiggle room in my character
totally.
count, my Twitter bio.
Totally,
So
we moved heaven and earth to adjust your bio. That was the key. Hey, tell me about Tariff Day. President Trump had promised this. He put a month delay on it in the first place, but now it's finally here. Contextualize this for us, because the way the media talks about it, President Trump is just a reckless psychopath. He's imposing tariffs on our allies and our neighbors and doing it for no reason whatsoever. What do you see?
Well, let me just look out the window real quick. And no, the sky is not yet falling. We are still okay. The apocalypse is not yet here. Look, Vince, one of the problems is that we essentially have more than an entire generation of brokers, of money managers, folks on Wall Street who were raised on this whole mantra of free trade no matter what. And it doesn't matter what your allies or enemies are doing, you should always reduce your tariffs, your non-tariff barriers, or don't have any at all. And that these things never serve any purpose. There's no right way to implement them. There's never a good time to implement them, et cetera. And so that's why you're seeing a market sell-off today, for example. That's why there's so much panic. And yet things have not come crashing down. Even during the first Trump administration, things did not come crashing down. In fact, if we look at the price indexes for imports, those actually fell after Trump implemented tariffs. So what I'm trying to say is, this whole idea that it's going to be catastrophic, that tariffs are always bad, that they can never serve a good purpose, that's just not correct, neither according to economic history nor economic theory. McKinley was probably the most famous example of how to implement tariffs well. Hoover, obviously, is a great example of how not to implement them. Fortunately, I think Trump is much more in alignment with McKinley than he is with Hoover. So I'm actually very, very hopeful on how things are going right now.
One of the things that is never discussed is the role that trade barriers play in President Trump's judgment here. We've talked before, Canada, for instance, imposes some very big trade barriers, for instance, on American dairy products to prevent milk from arriving in Canada from America. President Trump has described some of this tariff activity as retaliatory. What part of this story isn't being told?
Oh, Vince, I'm so glad you bring this up, that it's not just tariffs. There are what we call non-tariff barriers here as well. And probably the best example of that is quotas. So if you look at all of the different tariff and non-tariff barriers that Canada puts on American exporters, so American producers, whether that's a dairy farmer or a factory worker trying to sell their output into Canada, what we find is that there is a roughly the equivalent of a 25% tariff rate on all American exports going into Canada. That's pretty stifling, especially when you consider that certain particular products, like you mentioned dairy, the barriers there are much, much higher than the average. And so it puts us at a tremendous disadvantage. It makes it very difficult for the American worker to actually get his output across our northern border and into Canada. So when Trump talks about a 25% tariff on Canada, which he has implemented, that didn't just get pulled out of thin air. He and his team are looking at what Canada is already doing to the American producer and is essentially trying to level the playing field. And we should remember that when Trump does something, he is not so, single focused in his sight. He may have multiple reasons for doing a single thing. So when it comes to tariffs, he's not only looking at this in terms of let's try to level the playing field. He's also looking at this as, this is another way to raise revenue. This is also a way that we can essentially try to force Canada's hand in terms of getting them to police their border,
yes,
so that we don't have so much fentanyl coming in, and also so that we don't have Chinese companies setting up shop in Canada and abusing the USMCA, whereby they are getting around the different barriers that we have put on Chinese trade, and they are, again, using that agreement that we made with Canada and abusing it to get products and dump them here into the United States at lower prices at which Americans simply can't compete.
So, I'm just looking at a basic search on this, and I know you're more steeped in the numbers than I am. It looks like the size of our economy is about 10 times the size of Canada's economy. If we make that same comparison with Mexico, it's pretty drastic as well. The United States with an economy of nearly $30 trillion GDP, Mexico just 1.79. So these are much smaller economies we're dealing with. In other words, it seems like they have a lot more on the line. The pain is going to be a lot more meaningful for them than it is for us. And is that the kind of thing that could compel a behavior change more quickly, especially when it comes to stopping that fentanyl from coming in?
I think so. And not only do we have that massive ratio that you were just talking about, that's about 10-1 in terms of overall economy, but if you look at the percentage of our exports that go to Canada, it's very small. Conversely, the percentage of their exports that come here is very large. Again, the ratio is about 10-1. It's something like 8% or so of our exports go there and 80% of theirs come here. So if you're really going to have a trade war, if you really want to go toe-to-toe, which would be very unwise doing that with President Trump, but if the governor of Canada really has his heart set on that, I say go ahead, because you're going to send your own country probably into a full-fledged recession, and over here it'll basically feel like an economic speed bump.
It is amazing, and obviously I think one of the big things that President Trump is looking for is a clear sign that fewer Americans are dying. I realize, like, the media, they pretend like it's not happening. We have over 100,000 Americans dying due to drug overdoses every year. It is a devastating scourge on our country. And President Trump seems to be dead serious about this, that he will impose these trade barriers until the deaths stop.
Oh, exactly. Again, this is where I think people have a difficult time understanding what's going on with the president's thinking here. Just because he is using the same tool doesn't mean he's not using it for different purposes in different instances. In fact, even sometimes in the same instance, he's using that tool for multiple purposes, one of which is exactly what you just said, to try to reduce the number of Americans dying from these drugs coming in overseas.
So on the economic front, obviously, all of the attention is paid on just the, like the S&P 500, for instance. The stock market is always the indicator that the media talks about, but they don't talk about all of the other economic impacts that exist. When I talked to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about this, about tariffs, he was saying that much of a tariff that is imposed by the United States is watered down when it comes to the impact on the American consumer, that by and large that they don't actually suffer much by way of increased prices when it comes to these tariffs. How do you assess that? What's the impact on the average American when President Trump levels tariffs against foreign countries?
This is where it goes back to this idea of how are you implementing the tariffs? Are you doing it in a scientific way like McKinley did, or are you doing it in an almost random or shotgun style the way Hoover did?
Right.
And it looks like what this administration is doing, whether you talk to somebody like Secretary Bessent or someone like Secretary Lutnick, or if you talk to the president himself, it sounds like it's much more of the scientific approach. They are paying close attention to things like, where do Americans have alternatives? So we're going to put these huge tariffs on Canadian lumber, for example, because we're sitting on a gold mine of lumber just in the Pacific Northwest alone. And so if Canadian producers turn around and try to pass on the full cost of these tariffs to their American consumers, what will the American consumer do? Well, they're simply just going to turn around and buy from more American producers, because at that point, the price charged by the American producer will be less than the price charged by the Canadian one.
EJ and Tony, do you anticipate anything economic? Obviously, the president will discuss economics tonight. What are you looking for in his address to the nation?
I'm hoping that he does two things. First and foremost, that he reiterates just what bad shape we are in today, that he makes it very, very clear how much the American people have suffered over the last 4 years, because for those 4 years, we've been told that we weren't suffering at all. We were told, shut up and be grateful for how wonderful everything is and for how high the S&P is that you mentioned, right? And so I'm hoping he acknowledges Americans' pain, but then he also outlines his strategy for getting us out of this mess and tells us that, look, there is cause to be hopeful here. This is not going to last forever. We're going to get out of this.
I'm looking forward to it. I know you are too. In the meantime, EJ Antoni, in-house economist for the Vince Coglianese Show, and soon to be the in-house economist for the Vince Show. Where'd my last name go? Hey, thank you very much. Oh, as always, sir, good to talk to you.
Hey, Vince, my pleasure. Great to be with you, and congratulations